What's up guys, it's here. Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we have another deck that came out in Blazing Vortex. We're taking a look at S-Force today. A deck that I think is rather gimmicky, but it has a lot of potential, especially with the upcoming sets, because we know we're getting a really good trap card in the next set, Lightning Overdrive. But for now, I'm going to show you what the deck is capable of right now. If you want to pick it up now and you don't really want to wait another 3 months before it gets more support and you want to play it immediately, I'm going to show you the build that I've come up with. It's a deck that is very similar to Magical Musketeer, to be honest. It's a deck that you have to be very wary of where you put your monsters and where you move your opponent's monsters, because it gets effects to, depending on the zones that your opponent's monsters are facing, the security force monsters you have. So it's a deck that needs a lot of thought sometimes. It doesn't do much, to be honest. It doesn't feel very rewarding, but I know that people will want to pick it up early, so I'm doing this deck profile for those of you who want to pick it up soon. Before we begin, if you enjoy this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So to start off with the S-Force monsters, we play, of course, the main monster of the deck, 3 copies of S-Force Rapachi-Omaru. She's the monster that you won't have on the field every single time. You will be using her over and over again throughout the duel. So all of the S-Force monsters have an effect that affect monsters your opponent controls that are facing an S-Force monster in the adjusted column. So every monster the same column as one of your S-Force monsters with this card on the field cannot target that monster for attacks. So she kind of protects your monsters because they're very low stats, so they can't really protect themselves. So these effects that they cannot be targeted for attacks actually help sometimes. And her main effect is that as a quick effect, you banish an S-Force card from your hand, return this card to your hand, and then special summon an S-Force monster from your deck in defense. So you will be using this effect over and over again because it gets herself back into your hand, so you will have her for next turn. And this is how you get your S-Force monsters out of the deck. So you don't really need to play a lot more copies of any other monster than this card, because you will get access to them very easily from your deck. And you don't really want to draw them, because if you draw another S-Force monster aside from this card, they're just going to be banished fodder for her first effect, because she's the only monster you want to be normal summoning along with another monster that get access to this card because of its stats exactly. Pay attention to her attack and defense. She has 800 attack and 1000 defense, and I'm sure that some people that have been playing a few years ago actually know where this is going, because these specific stats actually match really well with another card from another archetype. Next up, we have 2 copies of S-Force Platina. Platina is a monster that when it's summoned, you get to you target one of your banished S-Force monsters, and then you special summon it. So when you banish S-Force monsters with Rapachi-Omaru, you just bring them back with Platina, because that's how you get your monsters on the field. Otherwise, you will be having trouble, because aside from Chi-Omaru, the other monsters either are not really worth normal summoning, or they're high level if they're worth normal summoning. So you don't really want to summon anything else, so you will be banishing them, but Platina is a monster that gets them back from the banish zone. And you do play a lot of cards that banish, you get abused very easily, especially in decks like this, because we know that when you play a deck maybe like a Goran Maju or maybe like Mutant, you will want to use those cards that actually use the banish zone, because some decks, especially in the meta right now, cannot really afford their cards to get banished. And if your deck actually uses the banish zone to its own advantage, then there's no reason why you should not play them. And also Platina's column effect is that all monsters facing an S-Force monster lose 600 attack. Next up, we have 2 copies of S-Force Gravitino. This card, the monsters in the same column as this card, they get banished when they leave the field instead, and when this card is summoned, you add an S-Force card from your deck to your hand. So this card gives you access to your spells and traps. Right now, I don't think there is a trap worth running in the deck. One trap did come out in Blazing Vortex, but I don't think it's really good. There is a new card in Lightning Overdrive called S-Force Chase that is going to be really huge boost for this deck, because it actually is a multiple bounce. So of course a card like that would be really good, especially if it's searchable. So Gravitino is the one that gives you access to more monsters. And Platina and Gravitino are the main attackers because they have the most amount of attack points. So the deck actually kind of struggles dealing damage, and because I play a lot of cards that lock you from your extra deck, sometimes you will have trouble singling out games. So this is why you want to try to control the board as much as possible until you actually have enough resources to go for game. 1 copy of S-Force Orifist. So this card is a one-off because it's a level 4 monster, and you don't really want to normal summon anything else rather than Rapachi-Omaru. So this is why I play 1 copy of just level 4 and the level 3 monster I'm going to show you later, that they're just here for the option. So this card, it says that your opponent is going to target any monsters in the same column as one of your S-Force monsters with card effects. So when you have this and Rapachi-Omaru on the field, your monsters are actually very protected, and you need to be paying attention to where your opponent puts the monsters, so you won't be putting your own monsters on those same columns so that the effects cannot actually trigger. Because if you know that your opponent has a couple list monsters in any single deck, and you know what they should, and you should know what they do. So when the opponent brings out a certain monster, you want to get an S-Force to that column if that monster is a threat, because this is how you actually protect your monsters. Because if you let them do whatever they want with their columns, and you don't really think about where you put your own cards, then going to cost you, because this deck is actually very mediocre right now. So you need to be very wary of how you put your monsters so you can get the most out of these effects. And also, this monster has an effect that when a monster your opponent controls activates its effect, you can actually banish an S-Force card from your hand and destroy that monster. Unfortunately, it does not negate, and this is why it's not worth playing more than one copy of this card. It's kind of like a Ghost Ogre, but still it's a decent card just for the option, because you can get access to any of your monsters from your deck with Rapachio Maru, so there's no really need to not play any of these. And the last S-Force monster is one S-Force Professor Digama. This card says that any monster in the same column as one of your S-Force monsters cannot change its battle position. This is good with some scenarios, because it also has the effect that if it's summoned, you target one of your opponent's monsters to change its battle position. So this usually stops your opponent from OTKing, and then you prevent that monster from changing its battle position, so you can actually kill it during the next turn, or maybe keep it there for a while, and if your opponent doesn't link with it, then they won't be able to do much. So it's just another one of that gives some utility to the deck. It's probably the worst of the monsters, but still I think, like I said, everything is worth running because of Rapachio Maru, because you can get access to them from your deck, and if you draw them and you don't really want them, you can just banish them for Rapachio Maru's effect. Now, the supporting monster that I think actually makes this deck a lot more consistent than it should be is 3 copies of Idia the Heavenly Squire. Yes, this card actually summons a monster from the deck with 800 attack and 1000 defense, and that's exactly how much Rapachio Maru has. So this card does look from your extra deck, I know, but it's such a good trade-off being able to get access to the one monster you want on the field ASAP. So even if you cannot summon from the extra deck, and this is one of the reasons that you kind of struggle going for games sometimes, but I think I would sacrifice consistency over power anytime, especially when I'm playing a rogue deck, so this is why I think you should be maxing out on this. For the hand traps, play 3 copies of Ash Blossom. Of course, it's the most generic hand trap in the game right now. 3 copies of Ghost Bill. I don't like Ghost Bill in pretty much any deck. I would always prefer Skullmeister instead of Ghost Bill, but there's a specific reason I play Ghost Bill and Ash Blossom in this deck. I would play Ash Blossom anyway, but Ghost Bill has the same text that Ash Blossom has, that you have to discard them from your hand in order to activate them. And this is important because I do play a lot of cards that actually prevent me from doing something like sending monsters from my hand to the grave. And one of those cards is the third hand trap, is 3 copies of Dimension Shifter. Like I mentioned before, if your deck abuses the banish zone, then you should be able to play those cards to your advantage and main deck stuff like D-Shifter, so you can actually catch your opponent off guard, because such a powerful hand trap against decks like Eldritch or against decks like Drytron can actually be very, very impactful. And this is why you need to be wary of the hand traps you play aside from D-Shifter, because you will not be able to use both of them. If you're playing something like Skullmeister, if you start with D-Shifter, then you won't be able to use Skullmeister, because it says that you have to send this card from your hand to the grave as cost, and you will not be able to do that. But Ghost Bill and Ash Blossom work perfectly with D-Shifter, so this is why I think this is the hand trap lane you should be playing. You play Impermanence too, but Impermanence is not really great that format. In another format, Impermanence is another really good card. Maybe you want to play Gamma as well if you feel like you're playing against a lot of combos, or Nibiru, but these are the hand traps you should be working around with when you play D-Shifter in the main. For the spells, play 3 copies of the Field Spell, 3 copies of S-Force Bridgehead. This is the searcher of the deck, so when it's activated, you add an S-Force monster from your deck to your hand. When an opponent's monster declares an attack on your S-Force monsters that are in the same column, then that monster you control can be destroyed by that battle. So it's something that you can actually keep monsters alive, and it's very, very important, especially with Rapachio Maru, because if your opponent negates her somehow before she can bounce herself back, then you have to protect her, because you will need to get access to another copy if you want to be able to keep playing, because without her the deck doesn't function at all. So this is why this card is actually really important for both effects, not just for its searching effect, but for its protection effect as well. 2 copies of S-Force Showdown. This is the card that special summons an S-Force monster from the hand in defense, or you target an S-Force monster in your grave and add it to your hand. The first effect is actually the one I'm working more with when I see playing this deck, because in testing I feel like sometimes a lot of monsters in the hand can be a little bit bricky, because you only need to banish 1 card for Chiyomaru, but when you have something like Gravitino in your hand, you want to get it on the field as soon as possible without waiting for your opponent's turn to use Chiyomaru's effect or something like that. So being able to get another monster on the field from your hand is actually very important, and since this card is searchable, I think you should be playing at least 2 copies of it. And also it's a quick play, so you can actually sometimes protect yourself maybe from an OTK, or summon a monster to a column that your opponent thinks has nothing to be afraid of, but then you summon something and suddenly that monster that your opponent summoned in a free column actually now is under all of your S-Force effects, so you will be able to save yourself, or maybe just make your opponent not be able to play. For the generic spells, play 1 copy of Rhoda. Of course, Chiyomaru is a warrior. Also, Idia is a warrior, but I don't think you would be searching Idia more of the time, because if you search Idia, then you're risking it getting asked, Veilered, or anything. Also, I'm not playing 1-for-1, which is something that Monarchs used to do, get easy access to Idia, which you could do in this deck theoretically, but the problem with 1-for-1 is the same that I said with some hand traps. They do not work under stuff that gets your card banished, because it's a cost to send from your hand a monster, and it doesn't discard it, it sends it from the hand to the grave. So under D-Shifter or under D-Fisher or Macrocosmos, you will not be able to use 1-for-1, so this is why I didn't want to play it. even though it's a consistency boost for the deck, I didn't want to have a potential dead card in my hand. One copy of Terraforming to search the field spell, one copy of Feather Duster. This deck actually struggles a lot against back row decks, and since Eldritch is such a popular deck right now, you need to be maining back row removal if you want to play a rogue deck, especially a one that doesn't do well against back row. So, of course, on top of playing Harpy's Feather Duster, I'm also maining 3 copies of Twin Twisters, and the reason I'm going with Twin Twisters over Cosmic Cyclone is because you won't be able to hit as many back row as possible, because you don't really have enough power to deal with back row, and since you play cards that get cards banished instead of going to the grave anyway, so you basically turn your Twin Twisters into a double Cosmic Cyclone, and you don't really care about the discard end, so because you can bring back any monster you discard that gets banished with your cards with Platina, so this is why I think Twin Twisters in this particular deck is much better than Cosmic Cyclone. Of course, Cosmic Cyclone is a much better card in this format in any other deck, but in this deck, I would highly recommend playing Twin Twisters over Cyclone if you want to main back row removal. And the last spell is one copy of Dimensional Fissure. Of course, like I said, you have to use those banished cards, and you get advantage of them because Platina can get them back from the banished zone. And for the traps, play 3 copies of Solemn Strike. You really need something to deal with established boards, and this deck struggles against that as well because it's a rogue deck, and a rogue deck that's not really complete yet. So you need to be able to adapt and see exactly what the deck needs, and what the deck needs is being able not only to disrupt your opponent with something like Solemn Strike, but dealing with established boards, because going second with your trap lineup and something like Rapachio Maru, you can get some monsters on the field, but you don't really have enough to deal with monsters that are already on the field, so you need cards like that to negate and destroy stuff. With same logic with that, play 3 copies of Dogmatica Punishment. This is a card that can potentially get rid of 2 cards, and if it doesn't get rid of 2 cards on the spot, you can just send your Wind Pegasus with this, so you have your opponent thinking twice before they destroy one of your own cards. So this is another card that's really good disruption, will also be really good going second on established boards, and it's another card that locks you from the extra deck on top of having Edea in the deck. This is why I said that the extra deck is not very relevant in this deck. It can actually work sometimes, but if you have either Punishment or Edea, you're going to have to wait a little bit before you use it. And one copy of Macrocosmos, because this card is auto-win against some decks, especially against Eldritch, because Defisher against Eldritch, while it's good because Eldritch gets banished, you need to get rid of those traps from and not send them to the grave, so this is why cards like D-Shifter and Macrocosmos are really, really good. For the extra deck, play 2 copies of the Link Monster, 2 copies of S-Force Justify. This is a Link 3 for the deck, which I think is kind of sad because it's not really easy to get this on the field. It needs 3 effect monsters, including an S-Force monster on top of that, so it's not like you can actually use a Link 2 and then an S-Force monster. You have to use these monsters, and the effect is not that specific because it says that you cannot summon set monsters to a zone this card points to. I'm not quite sure if that includes your opponent or if it just includes you, because if you put this in the main monster zone, bring it back from the grave, then does it lock on only your extra monster zone, or does it lock your opponent's monster zones as well, because it gives 3 zones to your opponent. So, but even if it doesn't do that for your opponent, it doesn't really matter, because if this card attacks like at the start of the damage step, you can just banish all monsters this card points to. So if your opponent puts monster on this card, so you can just banish them all. But the effect you really care about is that it has a quick effect that you target a face-up effect monster your opponent controls, you negate its effects, and then you move that monster to any monster zone this card points to. So you actually can summon, you can make your opponent's monsters be summoned to the zones you want. So even if they try to avoid the adjusted columns and the zones that S-Force monsters are in, you can just move them with this card. You're not going to summon this too often, but it's something that could come up, so this is why I'm playing 2 copies. And the extra deck, like I said, it's not very relevant. The only cards that you use pretty much all the time is Dogmatica Punishment's targets. The Link monsters are just here just for utility, because they could be summoned just in case. 1 copy of Anima, just in case Edea survives the turn because it's a level 1. 1 copy of Masquerena, Phoenix and Unicorn for the Nightmares. Boral Sword, sometimes you can go for OTKs because you do get to spam a lot of monsters, and especially during your opponent's turn with stuff like Gravitino Platina and Rapazio Maru, you can actually get the turn with 4 monsters during the start of your turn, so you can go for a Boral Sword and try to OTK. 1 Appaloosa, 1 Underworld Goddess of the Closed World because of Masquerena. Some Xyz monsters are here. 1 copy of Pleiades because Gravitino is a level 5 light, so you can summon Pleiades with it. 1 copy of Norito, Platina is a level 6 spellcaster, so you can summon Norito with her and have another interruption. 1 copy of Zeus because of those 2 Xyz monsters I just showed you. This can actually be summoned when you try to attack, and then you can have a monster that can board wipe or just use it for disruption. And for the punishment targets, play 2 copies of NTSS and 1 copy of Pegasus, because Wind Pegasus is better than the NTSS in the scenario that you don't really have 2 cards to pop right away, or you don't really need to pop 2 cards right away, so you can send this to make your opponent think before they actually destroy one of your cards, because of one of their cards going to get spinned back into the deck. So yep, that's the deck, guys. S-Force is a really fun deck. I think it's going to get a lot better with future support, and it actually follows the lore of Time Thieves, so I know a lot of people are going to be a fan of that to complete the set, because I know there are a lot of Time Thief fans out there, and this deck is very, very similar in artwork and lore design, so a lot of people are going to pick it up. So this deck profile is for you to get an idea of how you can actually play the deck. There are also other builds you can try. I've seen Isolde builds out there that do not really use Edea, but actually use Isolde ability to get access to Rapachiyomaru by sending the equip spells from the deck to the grave, but I think a build like that cannot actually use stuff like Deceiver very efficiently, so this is why I think this build is superior. So yep, that's it guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.